Um, Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation about something I think we've all been debating and thinking about in our communities. And I love this debate because I think it's bringing out the best of our critical minds and the best of the companies that are really striving to do what they can on achieving net zero and more than what they can, innovating all the time. Rather than using it as a greenwashing tool. But we know that that is going on. So we are here. I'm very pleased to introduce my esteemed panel. Ricardo de Colores is the Regional Director of South Pole. And Cesar Ducast is the Head of Carbon Neutrality Practice at Carbone 4. And it's lovely to see you both here today. So the format of this panel, if you just go to the next slide, we'll see kind of the overview of what we'll be discussing today. We're just going to talk through some of the challenges that you see in net zero targets and some of the ways in which current practice is not aligning with where we need to go to achieve global net zero. So if you could go to the next slide, please, we'll go through the overview. So we'll just go over net zero as a global target and why it's an important frame. We're just a quick review of the science and the kind of latest IPCC work on what the net in net zero means. We will talk about timing, ambition, and interim targets. We'll talk about scope, we'll talk about offsetting, and we'll cover equity, governance, and transparency. So with a good luck to us for covering all of that today, I will go to my first slide, and then I'll begin introducing the panel to some of my hard questions, which I'm looking forward to their answers on. So net zero is a controversial target, right? Recently, we have seen several reports, people claiming that net zero is being used as a framing device that is dangerous. But it comes from some physical science, right? So scientists at Oxford, in part, kind of acknowledge the need for us to consider cumulative emissions in the atmosphere on our pathway to reducing global temperature or capping global temperature. And of course, the Paris Agreement says let's try to stay to 1.5. This is an incredible ambition that we have. The IPCC makes it clear that in order to reach this target, we're going to need to balance emissions sources and removals, sinks, by around mid-century. And they've, there's recently some leaked updates that say that we need to move faster than that. So I think that that's a pretty call to action from the scientific community on what our global target is. The net in net zero is possibly the most controversial part. So what's very clear is that on all kind of currently available best models, we're not going to reach this target without some what we call negative emissions, some carbon removal. And these are sort of, you guys are all probably fairly familiar, right, with nature-based solutions. There's a whole range of carbon removal and storage options. But the concern is that these are being sort of overemphasized in current net zero targets because of some of the uncertainties that our previous panel talked about in terms of decarbonization potential, and also because people not wanting to spend the money. So I'm here to say that it is a very clear global target. We cannot get to net zero. We cannot kind of reach our temperature goals. It would be very hard to debate in the entire scientific community that we can do this without any carbon removal. This shows, fairly significant carbon removal, even in 2050 or 2060, that's the green in the chart. However, how that is interpreted by individual companies is something that is, up for discussion. And who gets to rely on the carbon removal, and how much is, and how we decide what residual emissions are is something that we're here to talk about, and that I know you all have been discussing. So my first question to our panel is, what do you think about the net zero controversy? Do you think that the global frame, net zero, is dangerous? Should we keep it? Should we throw it out? And do you acknowledge the science from both a global and kind of individual perspective? What are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Kaya. Maybe, Cesar, if you don't mind, I'll just quickly go first.
Please.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. So I think I totally agree, and also South Pole totally agrees with the science. We know the science has been there. I think what's important to realize, and maybe Kaya will talk about this in the study you guys conducted, where you compare the net zero targets versus what kind of action plans are in there. And South Pole has actually conducted a study which is quite similar, and we came to similar results. It's time to act, right? We have been talking for many, many years. We know the science is there. Nobody's debating the science anymore. So let's stop talking and let's start acting. I think that's kind of like the message I want to, kick off this panel. And also interested to hear, the thoughts of Cesar, and then go into the next couple points of the panel.
Yeah, if I want to answer quickly that question about the controversy about global net zero, I think you're mentioning basically the James Dyke, Wolfgang Knorr articles on the conversation. I think the point they're making is amazing, and I think it's the point we've been making for several years at Carbon 4. I completely agree with Ricardo when you say that we need to act now. But I think we should really be we should be careful about the fact that our actions are truly dedicated to what counts. And I think what counts mostly is to decarbonize. So I think the net zero could be dangerous at a global scale. It might be. I'm not saying it is, but it might be counterproductive because it might trigger too much hope, too much action on CDR, on negative emissions, and not that much on reducing emissions. So I think one key solution would be to try not to only talk about net zero at a global scale, but also to talk about separate targets between emissions reduction on the one hand and CDR, so negative emissions, on the other hand. And this echoes a paper that was published maybe 2 years ago by Duncan McLaren, who is a strong advocate for separating emissions reductions and removal. So I think globally net zero is a good marketing trigger, and it could be very good, but we should really be careful about putting our action on decarbonization first.
Yeah, okay. I agree also with Cesar. I think what we have been seeing as well is that, in some cases, companies use net zero as a marketing tool, which we believe is not the right thing to do, because what do you do if you're a CEO today and you say my company is going to be net zero 2050? You might not even be there anymore, being the CEO of this company. So who's going to hold you accountable for that? So I totally agree also with Cesar that, the actions that we need to take are focusing on decarbonization reduction first, and then see what happens with the rest, right? Which I think is also in line with Kaya thinking that you have.
It's so interesting. It is mostly in line, but you've both used a term first, which I wanted to bring up in the debate later. I think that we need to be doing these things in parallel. I just think that we need to be prioritizing emissions reduction. So I think the difference between the word first and prioritize is an interesting one that we can get into in a moment. But since you also raised the importance of interim targets, let's go to the next slide, because that talks about timing and ambition. Oops, I'm not sure. Oh, someone's excited to.
That's a great website.
The link on carbon removal. That's a very good resource. Sorry, I think I put that link in the document in case people wanted to look at it later. So timing and ambition. On the kind of left side throughout this presentation, we have the race to zero criteria, which we all are so pleased to have, as kind of a North Star, a guiding minimum floor as far as our efforts go in the race. And what I really pulled out here from the updated race to zero criteria, which if anybody hasn't seen, you should go take a look at it. It just was released a couple months ago, maybe even more recently, just around the time of this big debate, is that net zero targets must be mid-century by latest, but they also must reflect a maximum effort towards or beyond a fair share of 50% global reduction of CO2 by 2030. So that's a requirement to have a strong interim target in line with also the IPCC, science as to like what we need to do in the short term. What we're worried about is this ambition action gap. And, we see this reflected in our research. So we see companies using kind of net zero targets as a delay tactic. Not all companies are doing that, right? But some are. And so I have a kind of question for the panel, which is, how do we know that companies are acting now? I guess that's my first question. I sort of meant to ask you the three below, but I've got many questions for you. What do you two look at in terms of credibility when you're assessing a company to understand if they're proceeding immediately?
Shall I start?
Yeah, please go.
Okay.
I can.
So that's a really good question that you're mentioning here. It's how do you know that a company does act? I don't have any magic answer, but I think the first thing to look at is that before acting, has the company put itself the right strategy and the right the right target? And I think let's say the thing I'm looking at when I want to know if a company has a good or a bad target setting is every time I look whether it has understood that the real question is not really how can I be net zero, but it's rather how can I contribute to the global net zero as much as possible, and how can I transform myself to be compatible with a net zero planet. And it's not the same at all. So I'm sorry not to answer your question about action, but I think the first thing is to really make sure the company has understood that the net zero world we're going to live in 30 years has nothing to do with the world we're knowing right now, and that it should transform itself. So this is the real first criteria I'm looking at for assessing a company's credibility on the matter.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you, Cesar, on this one. I think what companies or also we as individuals need to stop doing is we need to stop looking only at our own backyard, right? Because yes, it's important what we do, but we have also heard from Innocent and Casey Group. It's we need to partner up. We need to be transparent. We need to understand our supply chains. There's suppliers, there's customers. We need to engage with each other. So we have to stop thinking, I'm great, but we need to start looking at, okay, how do I fit into the big picture, and how can I, as a company or as an individual, help reaching this target? In terms of, how do we see if a company is really taking action, right? So, I mean, from a personal perspective, if a company says we're going to be net zero by 2050, this is not an ambition, in my opinion. This is just, we need to be there. So please don't call it an ambition, because it's not an ambition, right? Also, to your other questions, I mean, depending on the business, yes, maybe the business you're in, it is challenging to reach net zero. So you need more time, right? So that's why targets are somewhere 2040, 2045. I mean, there are companies saying that there will be net zero by 2030. I personally think it's super challenging, because what we need is, as we discussed before, right? We need to also remove carbon from the atmosphere. We need these removal carbon projects, and they're just not there, right? They're not there at scale. And I mean, as South Pole is one of the biggest project developers, we also know on the supply side how challenging it is to develop these projects and the scarcity of projects that are around in the market at the moment. So just to come back to the question about how do we see if there's action, yes, you need to have a commitment, like a true ambition, but you also need to have a plan with intermediate steps, right? You need to set yourself also a science-based target. You need to reduce, you need to think about what is the best compensation offsetting strategy, something that we're going to look at. How do I contribute, increase in the availability of carbon removal credits in the market, which is needed to reach net zero eventually by 2050.
That's exactly right. I'm going to have to move on just because we only have 45 minutes, but I just wanted to say that I think, what both of you have shared is that there's a difference between my company going net zero and my company for net zero. And I think that, asking what we can do in this wider system, say a small tech company, they could go net zero tomorrow and then wash their hands and say, I'm done, I'm pure, I'm clean. But actually their potential to use their product to potentially change society for a net zero aim is far more impactful than, say, just decarbonizing their servers, which, they should be doing anyway. So I think that you've made a really great point there. I'm going to answer my own rhetorical question, which is the first one, which is, and I should cite this work here. The graph that you see is the result of Oxford's global stocktake. You can see at netzeroclimate.org, the full report. We did a global stocktake of the Forbes 2000 companies, in addition to many other governmental entities. And we looked at their net zero targets. And, it's very alarming to see that The majority are pledging net zero from 2040 to 2050, and most towards the end of the 2040s, and that there's even some pledging after 2050. And yet you raise an important point about, net zero by 2030. Well, that might actually be fairly possible for, like, the example that I gave, a small tech firm that just has to go renewable. But it also might be kind of difficult for, manufacturing companies that are dealing with heating opportunities that might not be there, incentives that aren't there from the government yet. And it possibly will mean that there's a significant amount of offsetting or investing in credits and sinks to be net zero by 2030. So I just wanted to answer that first question. Is the sort of 2040 to 2050 in line with the Paris Agreement and global justice aims? I would say no. I would suspect that my fellow panelists would say no. For most companies in the global north?
Well, is this in line, the fact to put a target between 2041 and 2050? I think it's dubious. Well, it depends. There is no clear definition on what global justice is and what the Paris Agreement is saying for private companies. So we cannot say for sure that this is not in line, but this is really strange that a company just commits for action in 30 years. So I think it's exactly when you make a financial plan, you're not just saying, I'm going to make this amount of money in 30 years. Yeah. You have interim targets and you have like year-to-year plan. So I think for the climate, it should be exactly the same.
So yeah, sorry, go ahead. Now, I just wanted to add, because I think we also need to keep in mind, what is the role of companies in the so-called global north, right? So, I mean, obviously, oftentimes companies in the global north, they have supply chains ranging to the global south, right? So as a company in the global north, regardless of the ambition that you set yourself, you have a responsibility to invest also in climate justice, right? So you need to engage with your suppliers on the ground. You need to help them decarbonize. It's all part of an ecosystem. So I think there is a clear link between, the responsibility of companies in the global north and, contributing to climate justice.
Great. Yeah, and I think that we've all made it fairly clear that we need the final 40% to be setting interim targets. I think, Cesar, you put it really well, how companies actually operate on maybe 4-year cycles, not 30-year cycles. And then for those going net zero by 2030, I think that this is really admirable, and I think it's quite like I think the B Corps are very admirable in this goal, and it's going to demonstrate to us how we deal with some of these uncertainties. So being kind of innovators in that space. However, we might have to deal with some offsetting questions. So if we'll go to the next slide, we can talk through some of those. So on the left, you'll see current practice that we found on offsetting in the Forbes 2000. Some companies are not offsetting, a small percentage are not offsetting. A slightly larger percentage, but about 15% are offsetting with restrictions, which is kind of our low bar we had to set in order to gather data, because the offsetting principles that we've put out and the Race to Zero criteria principles on offsetting, as well as several other standard setters, have just sort of emerged. So at the time of gathering this data, it wouldn't have been fair to judge them against our own principles yet. However, it is pretty, I think it shows a lot to see that many companies have not specified how they will be offsetting. They've just said offsetting, and that, as we know, is not sufficient. I think if you are planning on doing kind of really tricky carbon accounting, to say, I am going to continue emitting, and therefore I am relying on either someone else or someone I'm paying for within my company to deal with that emission source, you need to be sort of saying how that balances. One thing that my professors at Oxford like to talk about is that, different gases have different residence times in the atmosphere. And so if you're offsetting, carbon emissions against nature-based solutions, which maybe have a shorter sink lifetime, then that's a very, very long residence time in the atmosphere. How are you going to make sure that sink sticks around? Are you putting in kind of legal or institutional mechanisms to ensure that nature is preserved for hundreds of years, if not thousands? And so these are sort of things that are not specified in a lot of corporate targets, and that we're hoping to see come to light as net zero strategies are filled out. And people do this difficult thinking. I understand why companies are, would be reserved about putting out something until they kind of know how they're going to do it, since this space is so hot. But this goes back to this earlier debate that we already jumped into in our first slide. What does prioritize reduction mean to you? That's the other kind of major thing that comes up in offsetting questions. I heard you guys say offset first. So could you go into that a bit?
I'm not sure if we said offset first. I think
Oh,
what we
sorry.
both said is reduce first.
You
Yeah.
said reduce first, offset second.
So maybe I can, yeah, I mean, I think the other way around wouldn't really work. So yeah, let's stick to reduce first. So I think just to capture it, I think we have passed the point of luxury where we can discuss, around what should we do? Should we do A? Should we do B? I think we have to do things in parallel, as you also say, Kaya. I think we need to set ourselves a net zero target. We need to set ourselves a science-based target. We need to reduce. We need to invest into carbon removal, but we also need to compensate starting today, because what does compensation do, right? Compensation channels finance, much needed climate finance to developing countries, where this is also the beauty of the voluntary carbon market, right? It channels this money to projects that need it, but it also helps scaling up the market, right? The more money that is channeled in the voluntary carbon markets, the more project developers such as South Pole and others will be attracted moving into developing more high quality carbon projects which are needed. Because now what is happening right now is that the price of a carbon credit is just far too low, right? And there is no incentive for any project developer to say, why should I develop a high quality removal project that I can only sell at €5? It just doesn't work. It just doesn't make sense. And it's also not a fair price on carbon, just to be clear on that.
I think, yeah, I think I agree with you, Ricardo, when you say that we need to do the three in parallel. I mean, reduce your emissions, remove CO2, and then finance beyond your value chain for emissions reduction projects. I think it's key. And I think both the term prioritize reductions, that also can be understood that you reduce first, but also the word offsetting are both deceptive. And I'll try to explain why in my opinion. When we say reduce first, you imply that there is a point where you will stop reduce. But it's not true, because actually the IPCC, the Paris Agreement, and every possible structure on the planet that is talking about climate science is saying that we should continuously reduce by 5 to 7% per year until 2050, if not after 2100. So I think we will never stop reducing. So it's not a good thing to look at as a sequence, like I reduce first and then I offset. It doesn't work. And I think the word offsetting is a bit deceptive, because it implies that you can use offsets to subtract with your own carbon footprint. And I think this is really dangerous. I think, as Ricardo said, we really need to look at the things in parallel. So you have an indicator that is called your own emissions that you need to reduce every year. And then you have a second indicator, which is the amount of money you put on projects that will help remove CO2 or help reduce emissions elsewhere. So I think the term offsetting is not the right term, actually. And we've been using it for decades. And I think it's totally counterproductive. I think we should rather talk about contribution. It's just financial contribution for good climate projects that we need to deliver in parallel of your own decarbonization strategy. So to me, we should reduce emissions and in parallel contribute to global carbon removal. And this is maybe what we need to do is maybe to really look at the problem by saying we need to contribute to net zero at a global scale, not try to be net zero, not try to have our own zero, because the key scientific milestone is really to get to the global collective net zero. So I think that's what I should point out here.
Yeah, so I think that that's definitely the altruistic approach. However, it's hard to draw a line around that. You know, our contribution could be endless, and companies do have, you know, a finite budget, and so they do want to kind of know what is their responsibility. How do I know I'm kind of in line, even if then I decide to go further? So, you know, one thing we've tried to do at Oxford is to emphasize what is a net zero aligned offset. If we are actually going to get into what offsetting really means at a scientific level. And something that I like to put up is some really basic math, because my professors, my physics professors particularly, love to put up really complicated equations on the board and then explain them to our audiences. And I usually end up having to stick around for the Q&A after that. But this is a really simple one, right? So one thing that people are using right now as an offset, and which may be a credible sort of carbon credit or a sink that we should be investing in, or rather it's not really a sink, it's more like an avoided emission, right? So a lot of people are saying, I am going to keep emitting, but I'll pay you or someone else to reduce your emissions. Now, like 1 plus 0 equals 1, right? We still have 1 ton of emissions up in the atmosphere. And so that is not a net zero aligned offset. 1 plus -1, you know, if you are investing in a sink, equals 0. So if you've actually, you know, invested in something that is going to take carbon out of the atmosphere, that is truly additional and that has sort of good permanence, then you might be able to say that's a credible net zero aligned offset. Now, I do sympathize with the argument that perhaps we should move away from this emphasis on offsetting, but I think it's something that people are doing. And so if they're going to do it, they should do it well. By the net zero target date, you shouldn't be doing math that goes 1 plus, you know, 0 equals 0. And that's something that, you know, we've received quite a bit of pushback on, because there's a lot of really great avoided emissions projects out there that need financing, but we should be financing them simply because that's our fastest route to reduction. You know, if someone else can reduce their emissions through a really great project, and we are currently waiting for some technology to come up to reduce our emissions, we should be helping them out. But how we kind of do that in terms of our accounting, and we say, oh, okay, you know, that emission no longer exists. It's not true, right? So I think that that's a really interesting debate that we're having.
Yeah, and sorry, you had a point to finish.
No, go ahead.
No, I think I just wanted to add on that, and saying that, I mean, again, speaking from the supply side, it would be amazing if we could today already invest in, you know, sinks, because there is abundance of them, and we can pay the credit. But the reality is that there is simply not enough projects that remove carbon from the atmosphere for the like amount of emissions that we need, right? And oftentimes these projects, they are like rather expensive to develop. So then also the price of the carbon credit becomes more expensive, which is then, again, when we talk about budgets of organizations, it's a little bit of a challenge, right? And I also agree with you, Kai, that you say, okay, there's really a lot of good quality, high quality, you know, certified by certain standards avoidance project in the market right now. And what's happening in the carbon market, what we haven't seen in the previous years, is that there is a shortage of supply, which actually is pushing prices up, which again leads to what I said before. So new project developers coming in, really, you know, having the money and the finance to invest and to develop more high quality removal projects, right? What we actually need in order to then reach net zero in the future.
Yeah.
If I could, oh no, sorry, Kaya, you had something to.
No, I just wanted to address a question from the audience. It says, Kaya, who will pay for emission reductions such as circular economy, switching fossil fuels, energy efficiency? And I think that's a really good question. And I think what Oxford is saying is that we shouldn't just abandon those projects right now. And if you want to use those projects as sort of offsetting in the interim, that's fine. But by the net zero target date, that should not be how you are balancing your emissions, because that doesn't add up to net zero. But if you want to be financing those projects now, and even calling it an offset, okay, it's a bit misleading. And that's why we think companies should be spelling out their strategies and explaining, you know, how they're thinking about it. And if they have kind of a gradual curve where they've got emissions reductions at the base for the next kind of 10, 15 years, because those are kind of the best low-hanging fruit opportunities we have. And then over time, by the net zero target date, they're sort of moving to removals with long-term storage. That would be, I think, an offsetting strategy we could get behind. And that's what our principles say.
I think the two small equations are doing a good point, is that to show that when you buy a carbon offset, it's either an avoided emission or a carbon removal. That's really surprising. You know, when I started analyzing this a few years ago, the voluntary carbon market, I was completely surprised that there was no distinction that was made. When you buy a carbon offset, it's either avoided emissions or removal, whereas the two are completely physically different. So it's a good point to say that a carbon offset can be of two different natures. But I think the two equations here have a small issue, is that it's a rationale at the scale of the company itself. And the question it addresses is, am I net zero when I buy this kind of offset or not? So of course, when you have as a point of view, the point of view of your company, you will say, yeah, let's prioritize removals because it makes zero, whereas avoided emissions makes just one. But I think, you know, when you switch from looking at your own backyard to looking at your contribution at the global scale, I think avoided emissions carbon offsets are truly great. And maybe even more important at the small, you know, at the short term than removals. So to me, we will need to do both, and maybe even more avoided emission offsets right now, because contributing to net zero means right now mostly to contribute to decarbonization on a global scale. So I think it's really important to say that carbon offsets can have two different natures, but it's, I think, very important also to not just prioritize on carbon removal only just because it removes CO2. Because we also need some finance to reduce emissions elsewhere.
Yeah, but I think this also points to a gap that we have in the public sector, which is that we need the right, you know, subsidies, policies, incentive structures, carbon pricing, so that it becomes something that companies are doing, that they are reducing their emissions without having to rely on another company coming in to pay for it. What I have a problem with is a company that is very large, that has benefited from and profited from selling, you know, heavy emitting products for a long time, then suddenly creating a carbon credit and which is something that they should be doing anyway, right? They should be spending to decarbonize their product in order to keep it something that they can sell. And then they sell it to a well-meaning kind of smaller company as a carbon offset. I have an issue with that. And I think that's so much of why, given kind of the lack of clarity in the voluntary carbon market, the best thing companies can do is explain their rationale, have the community kind of weigh in, and think through their offsetting. I have a friend who's, you know, working on his own net zero strategy for his small company. It's a circular economy company, and he's like, well, actually, I'm gonna invest in some offsets in India near where we have a factory, because then I can have people go check on them. He doesn't believe in the kind of monitoring and verification system, and so he's going to send his friends down to go make sure that the trees that he's planted are still there. And I just think, you know, everyone has to think through it in their own way to make sure they're comfortable with all these different issues: verification, permanence, additionality, and kind of the social and equity questions as to how we're shifting money around. And hopefully we'll get some more regulatory frameworks, but I don't think we need to wait for that, because those might be a few years down the line. I'm afraid we've dwelled on this section so much because it's so fascinating, and I hope we can continue the debate offline with all of the participants. I'd be happy to share this presentation and more, and I know our panelists are passionate and happy to engage, but if we could go to the next slide. So scope is another one that I think is really tricky, and there's a lot of shared responsibility questions that come up in scope. Now, the Race to Zero criteria and kind of the community has weighed in and said we need to be including scope 3 for all businesses. But again, quite like with offsetting, you need to be talking about what your plan is for scope 3. That there is some question as to, you know, whose responsibility is scope 3. If you sell a vehicle and someone drives it around for, you know, 20 years, should they be paying for those emissions, or should you be paying for some of them? Or there are things you can do to sort of reduce their demand in kind of the creation of the product to reduce the scope 3 emissions? You probably should be doing those things, but should you be paying for all of those emissions? And what if, you know, one person's scope 3 is another person's scope 1? You've sold a vehicle to a company, and then they're driving it around, and so that would be their scope 1 emissions as they kind of create a product with the vehicle. What do you guys think about this question about how we share responsibility? As far as I've come, and as far as I think the Race to Zero has come, is that we need to just at least be outlining a plan and demonstrating how we're working with our partners if it's their Scope 1 emissions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's not so much a what if. I mean, most of the times your Scope 3 is somebody else Scope 1, 2. I mean,
It's
almost
always the case,
100%.
actually.
It's always the case, yes. So it's not like a what if question. It's just the case. I think what you need to do is you need to look at your upstream and downstream supply chain and understand your role, right? Am I the car manufacturer? Am I like the one that has the power to really change something? Am I the one that has, the power to be transparent? Then, I mean, it's not a rule, but then you should kind of like assume a little bit more responsibility, right? In my opinion. And I think what we have to do when it comes to greenhouse gas reporting, scope 3 or scope 1 or 2 of somebody else, we just need to increase transparency. I think again, this comes back to what we said before. Everybody's looking at their own backyard. Everybody's trying to get their GHG inventory 100% correct without really thinking, okay, what is kind of like the ecosystem of partners, suppliers, and customers that I can collaborate with to increase the transparency and the quality of the data, and how can we together tackle what is my Scope 3, but what is maybe their Scope 1 and 2, right? It comes all down to also engaging with your supply chain and understanding what is my role in the supply chain outside of my backyard.
Yeah, I think the question, whose responsibility is Scope 3? I think we should not talk about responsibility, because this is not really the way the GHG protocol has designed the Scope 1, 2, and 3. It's more a question of dependency. The question that the Scope 1, 2, and 3 answers for the company is, how dependent am I from fossil fuels? And Scope 3 is always someone else's Scope 1. So it's the kingdom of double counting here, but it's not. It's really okay. There is no problem with that, because you will never make the sum of all Scope 3 of everyone. But we really need to see Scope 3 as, how dependent am I from fossil fuels? And maybe it's important to point out that Scope 3 is very often let's say a category where companies still have a lot of power to change things. We should not think Scope 3 as something very far from the company. It's really sometimes really intricated with its own business model. When you look at a car manufacturer that sells SUVs, for example, it's going to count the consumption of the SUVs by the clients on the Scope 3. But if the company decides to stop selling SUVs and sell bikes instead, I mean, not motorbikes, but real physical bikes, it's going to reduce its Scope 3. And it has the full power to do it with their own operation and own strategy. So Scope 3 should be addressed. It's maybe the top priority for most of the companies. And there is room for changing things.
Yeah. I think vehicles are a really obvious one, in which, the UK's new law to move away from combustion engine vehicles just reflects that this is an area where we can actually decarbonize quite quickly. And so we have a responsibility, and these companies have a responsibility to deal with those Scope 3 emissions. I'm afraid we've got to move quickly along, because we have 5 minutes left in this section to the last bit. This all kind of relates back to transparency, everything that you guys have said. One of my pet peeves on Scope 3 is that companies will say things like, we have a plan for reducing 98% of our Scope 3 emissions. And then there's a small clause like, except those produced by the use of our products. That kind of lack of transparency and that kind of fudging of the words just so it looks like you can get a win, it really speaks to what you both, I think, have been saying, which is that we don't all collectively win by having one company claim victory on this problem. We all collectively win when we start opening conversations through companies' net zero strategies about how we're going to tackle this together, and creating those partnerships and having those conversations. And that's where the best solutions come in. So if we could go to the next slide, we'll just talk a little bit about transparency and governance and equity. So the Race to Zero criteria says that we have to commit to report publicly both progress against interim, as we've talked about, and long-term targets, as well as actions being taken at least annually, which I think is quite new. Companies have not really been reporting annually on the actions that have been taken. There's really been an emphasis on emissions reporting, but not kind of the actions, the specific mechanisms. And that actually makes it very hard for companies to compare notes, because it's like, oh, okay, somehow this other company that is just like me reduced their emissions, but how did they do it? So I think it's really cool that this word actions is put in here. And to the extent possible, report via platforms that help us kind of measure our global progress. That's great. And then a leadership practice is to seek to enable all actors to continue the global transition towards net zero, in brackets, through engagement, information sharing, access, finance, and capacity building. And this is kind of a part of the empowerment and equity question. And to develop pledges and plans with considerations of equity, drawing on the Sustainable Development Goals, Article 2 and Article 4 of the Paris Agreement. Now, there's so much to get into here, and we unfortunately don't have a lot of time, but I think it's really interesting just to look at the numbers. You know, less than 10% of companies consider equity in some way. Some of that is just transition for workers. Some of that is thinking about the timing of their targets, thinking about, you know, we are deciding to go sooner so that people in the developing world can have a little bit more time. Some of it is thinking about equity in terms of their offsetting strategies, and like if that is good for the people, the welfare of the people and the places where they're offsetting. And then, you know, again, we've seen just 60% have interim targets. Just 60% of Forbes 2000 companies, these are big companies that can probably afford to have a published plan, And I've had a look through quite a lot of those companies. And I'm afraid that that plan is not at the level of detail that we would like based on this presentation. And so I think if there's one takeaway from this presentation, it's that you need to have a good reporting mechanism, and then you need to publish your actions and your thinking. And, you know, companies are very scared to do this because there's kind of a litigation culture. But I think, you know, no one's going to be mad at you for saying, we're thinking through this in this way. How are you guys thinking about it? You know, and maybe we should be talking about it in a little less legalistic way and a little bit more of a collaborative way. So I would just like to close this panel by asking the two of you, what are examples of best practice in governance, transparency, and equity that you have seen? And how can companies be more credible and transparent overall as they develop their net zero strategies?
Okay, let's. I could go first. Well, it's hard for me to find some examples of best practice, because no best practice pops into my mind right now. I'm sure they exist, but maybe a way to answer this question is that I think the voluntary action and the transparency and the fact to disclose everything is key, but it's not enough. And I think we have very barely talked about it, man. I think there is a huge role in regulation in this. I think we don't have time to wait for companies to disclose voluntarily their actions and do effectively what they have disclosed. I think I don't remember the temperature going on right now in Canada, but it's just terrible. And I think there is a crucial need for collective action that might constrain at some point in some way companies to really act on given criteria. I think France is a bit advanced on I'm French actually, but I think we're doing interesting stuff, because there is a law saying that companies should disclose their scope 1, 2, and 3. So this is like compulsory in France. And soon enough, we might have more regulation about constraining them to reduce their emissions, or to avoid a certain amount of emissions thanks to their products and services, or to put that amount of money for carbon removal projects or avoided emissions projects. So I think we really should look at what we can do, like as a collective action from the public sector to constrain a bit and to accelerate action. But I also agree that transparency is key.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy, Cesar, that you picked up the question first, because I actually also don't have any practical examples. It's just because they don't, like, as you say, Kai, as well, right? The plans that you looked at, they don't really, are up to a standard that you would like to see them. And especially, I think when it comes to equity, this is something that, which we can also see on the graph, right? It's something that maybe, companies or countries, they don't understand yet fully how they need to, report on that. So maybe that's something we should also invest in a little bit more. But if I may, then I tackle the second part of the question, is how can companies become more credible? And, it links back, to the study you guys have done as well, is that, okay, companies that have a net zero target, they also need to have a plan. So you can't just say we'll be net zero and then not having a plan in place. I think this is the first and most fundamental step to increase the credibility. And then from there you can build on. But you should really start having, intermediate steps and measure your progress along the way.
Thank you so much. Okay, final slide, just to give some initial thoughts on equity. This is just something I've been thinking through. If you could go to the final slide, please. So, if in doubt about how to consider equity as part of your net zero strategy, I might not call these scopes because that might be confusing, but you kind of think about it in terms of like, have you considered your local community and how your net zero strategy and the changes that you're making in your product or your company, how is that going to change your workers and the kind of people in that close community? You probably want to ask them, you probably want to do some engagement. That's always kind of the top priority when it comes to equity, is have you empowered people and asked them what's good for them? And then scope 2 emissions, how is this going to affect the workers in your supply chain? I had an interesting conversation with a major food company that said, we're not pulling out of palm oil that might be linked to deforestation, because we'd rather engage those small shareholder farmers and work with them to change their practices. Because if we just pull the business away, that's not good for people. And it also will probably continue to make them even more dependent on restoring their natural resources there. So I think that's a really interesting question that comes up in supply chain engagement. And then I think, this question of our global community that we've come back to over and over again in this panel, does your net zero strategy address sort of climate refugees and the people who are currently suffering as a result of the disaster that we've all created? And is your company going fast enough and investing, in kind of the impact areas that it needs to help mitigate that harm? And I think if you've covered those sort of three areas, I'm sure it's inconclusive, I'm sure it's incomplete, but that would be a good starting place as you're developing your net zero strategy, just doing that mapping exercise. I want to thank our panelists both so much for their really thoughtful discussion. It was such a pleasure to speak to you both. And I need to hand over to Yelis now and apologize for going over time. This has been really fascinating, and I hope we can continue the discussion in the chat.
Well, I'm truly grateful for Kaya, Ricardo, to Cesar for making time for this panel in your very busy agendas. I'm so conscious of that. But you can't believe the comments in the chat that we're going through. The audience was amazed to hear about your understanding and articulation around this very complex questions. And this is really what our community wanted to, get from today. So really grateful for your contributions and sharing your perspectives. We will now move into closing of this session, but the day program is going to continue. To all of our B Corps, a heads up, as of today, we launched our Progress on Net Zero survey. So we will be tracking on how our community, our B Corp community is progressing on net zero. So we look forward to this survey and the results so that we can show in transparency to ourselves first and to the world how we are moving towards our 2030 target. So as we come to this close, I think so much has been already said by our speakers, in the chat, by our audience. I will leave it there and I will let you enjoy the rest of the program on Scope 3, on activist business, on many levels. And we actually have a beautiful spoken word artist who is going to do our closing. I will let her speak. And goodbye, everyone, for now.
Ever seen time fly? Watch it slip through your fingers like a cloud passing by. Too slow to notice it leaving, too fast to make it stop. All we've known is to destroy like it's breathing. The pitter-patter of raindrops match the sounds of clocks counting down. Tick, tick. How lucky we are to live. We are a fraction of a second in Earth's lifetime, yet she is our only lifeline. Resilient, we stand on our own 2 feet. I'll tell you, reimagining the future has never tasted so sweet. Like nectar to a bee, honey to a home. No one can do this alone. Tick. The promise of restoration lives within us. We see her in the hues of the youth, and she's asking you, what will you stand for? Now is the time for our regeneration.